is kind of which is the first question top of mind for most early stage startup founders. I think when most people start their company and most data practitioners or ML practitioners start their company, they look at the market, they look at like how crowded the landscape is on the analytics side. There are no questions and no doubts that right from the connectors to the storage engines to transformation tools that are out there, to the BI tools, and the same thing we see in the ML ops landscape as well. It's becoming pretty crowded. But at the end of the day, what really matters is like what business applications or what value is that data adding within your organization. So I'd love to start with Inderpal. You have a pretty unique perspective, both from IBM's perspective as well as like the customers of IBM. A lot of them have built like complex products and softwares like IBM itself. I'd love to understand from your perspective, like what are one or two unmet or relatively unaddressed business use cases that you see today that are not being addressed by the current tools that founders can learn from?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I was very pleased to see that the companies that were showcased in the previous session, they hit on those points. Trust in AI is a huge gap. That's something that needs to be addressed. And it's because without that, I just don't see AI succeeding in the enterprise space like it is. It succeeded in the consumer space, but in some sense, the consumer is very different from the enterprise customer, right? So the enterprise customer is going to be far more scrutiny on aspects of transparency, explainability, robustness, all that stuff. So I think that's a major one. The regulatory pressures that are coming from the twin forces of sovereignty around data, whether it be individual sovereignty, so privacy and those types of things that you see in GDPR, or in terms of nation state sovereignty, in terms of where data originates, how you have to treat it and so forth. That's putting also some substantial pressure into how these data networks that enterprises have that are operating globally, how they should be dealt with. So that's again another major, I wouldn't say it's a pain point. I'm just saying that those are difficult problems, and it's something where I think startups could focus on and meet with success. I think the last one I would say is just the move towards real time. The expectation that you are going to be able to reflect what's happening in real time as well as respond in close to real time is another key aspect of where things are going.
That sounds great. And before moving to the next panelist, I think I'd love your point around like the trust and privacy piece and most like including Fiddler and other products out there, like obviously want to sell more of that value prop as well beyond monitoring features in production. I'm wondering, do you see like the internal stakeholders working more closely with each other now, given like that becomes top of mind for the enterprise, where ML platform teams do work closely with compliance and with heads of security, which in the past has been kind of working in their own specific functions?
Who are you asking?
I'm asking you that question, that how do you see that?
No. So on that front, to be successful in that area, you have to have a few areas that actually work very closely together. The data office, the privacy office, the chief information office, specifically the CISO piece, the security officer piece. These three areas have to work very, very closely together,
right,
to be able to pull that thing off. Otherwise, you can't scale. And if you have to establish you have to have a framework that's already set up that encompasses all three of these.
Yep, makes sense.
That's part of your foundational setup. Yeah.
Sounds great, Inderpal. Thank you. I think one thing that you mentioned that I think is relevant for Murli as well, which is the real-time aspect. I think Murli, you've on the banking side, I'm sure from acquiring customers to seeing how they're engaging with the bank itself to building products for those customers. I'm sure like real time is becoming more and more important from a machine learning perspective. Have the same question for you in terms of unmet needs, but would love to start with, like, is real time one of them, and what are the others that you see as a part of the mix in all these different dimensions that I might have outlined or missed?
100%, Apurva. Good to see you. Inderpal, good to reconnect, and Krishna as well, and fellow panelists. So look, in banking, the beauty of banking is it's a very high touch, high interaction, high transaction sector. And so, whether you're swiping your card or making any one of many transactions, that's data that can tell us something about you, that can tell us what we should be doing to build more timely and contextual relevance with you as a customer. So this notion of real time is mission critical. If not, the entire sector would be doing itself a big disservice by not harnessing the power of all of those interactions and transactions, separating signal from noise and figuring out how do we engage with that customer. Sometimes it is a customer experience issue. Sometimes it is an upsell, cross-sell. Sometimes it's a surprise delight. It can cover that whole gamut. And in essence, what the customers are doing is they're signaling to us what they might be interested in. And the real strength is in being able to infer those signals and mirror that back to them. So that's sort of the crux of where I think the industry is going and continues to need to go. In terms of an unmet need, I'll just pick one, Apurva, if I may, is what I find the big struggle for me is we build all of these sophisticated models, but there aren't consistent software solutions in the marketplace to embed those algorithms in to be able to drive end-to-end adoption. So I'll give you one simple example. Interest rates are going up, we all know that. And the questions that banks deal with is, hey, how do we think about pricing on the retail bank deposit side? And how much should you be offering for a CD or checking or what have you? You get all of this data about what the competitors are doing, what the Fed is doing, and so on and so forth. Now, we built all of the algorithms to understand customer behavior, prospective and existing. But then we went out to the marketplace. There is no single software that we could use that our product managers and others could use to simulate and optimize and make decisions on. And that's just one example. I could actually literally give you a dozen examples like that. We ended up building that in-house, and we're actually ended up doing quite a bit of that, more than perhaps I might like. But I see that gap. And the challenge to me is, unless you're selling a broad infrastructure capability, in large organizations, everything is sort of interconnected. So you go to one function or one player at a certain level of the organization, and you get a particular view. But the problem is that person is part of a very complex ecosystem, and that ecosystem needs to progress in synchrony. So how do we kind of accomplish that is probably a challenge that many startups will sort of grapple with.
I love the specific example, and also and I'm sure many founders in the audience would like that you don't want to build a lot internally, and you do want to buy externally if it kind of fits the workflow your needs. And I think I have more questions around like how they can learn that going forward, but this is super helpful. Thank you. I have a similar question from Anthony as well. And Anthony, you've been as a part of Dunn Bradstreet, you've been providing like data and analytic solutions to multiple organizations. And I, again, don't want to call it unstructured data based on how it was just outlined. So maybe let's call it diverse data. But looking at whatever is happening in the generative AI space right now, do you see applications of that for your current clients today? Because we've seen most of those applications mostly limited to marketing and sales, and that too more bottoms up, prosumer focused, not really enterprise focused. But I'm wondering, like, and I'm starting with that targeted question, but if you have any other areas, one area that you'd like to cover as an unmet need, would love to hear that too.
Thank you. I'm also sensitive to not saying unstructured, so I think I'll say massively heterogeneous, non-heteroscedastic. That'll probably catch on. But that was funnier in my head. Anyway, in terms of unmet needs, there's sort of this journey between what customers want and what they need. And very often what they're saying they want is related to what they need, but not exactly what they need because we need to talk to each other in order to get there. So in my humble opinion, I think that we are facing challenges that we have yet shown the light on around veracity of information, around potential adversarial manipulation of information. A lot of the models that we use swallow the data, assume it's all true, assume certain things about quality. And there's no evidence to suggest that you can assume any of those things, especially in this day and age. So I'm not just talking about fraud. I'm talking about competitive advantage. If I know what kind of models you're using or what kind of data you're using, I can sort of, the example, the back and forth that went on in the previous session about what percentage of big data projects fail. A little bit of that is in how you slice the data and what you call a big data project. So we can do things like that, or we can do things that are much more pernicious and malfeasant. So there's definitely that, and that is absolutely in the air. The other thing is what I call naive NLP, and I don't mean it as an insult, but NLP that consumes words and says something like destroying is always bad. Well, if you destroy something bad, it's good, and if you destroy something good, it's bad. So we and we have algorithms, vector-based algorithms, and so forth that are very good at helping us with things like that until something that used to be a verb becomes a noun because somebody is named that and they become famous. The big example I use all the time is Trump, which used to be a verb and now it's more likely a proper noun. So these models tend to have learned from the way we used language in the past, and language is always changing. So I think the morphology of language in whatever we're allowed to call unstructured data is definitely something we need to pay attention to. Veracity adjudication and adversarial manipulation are absolutely out there. And then I would echo everything as usual that Inderpal said about trust and perturbation, model governance of data in general. Let's just say data stewardship. The changing regulatory environment is something that we can't just keep complying with the next big tectonic thing that happens. We have to get better at seeing where these things are going. There used to be a lot of talk about RegTech. I don't hear much about it anymore, but understanding where is the talk about regulation going so that we can get better at leaning into where it's going rather than where it just went. And then the last thing I'll mention that is sort of implied in a lot of the things that we've talked about, but not directly stated, is that no matter where you are in the world and no matter what data localization or cross-border data transfer laws or whatever exists, provenance and permissible use as metadata. Where did you get this data, and by what right do you think you're allowed to use it for the purpose that you're using it? All of that is part of the sorts of transparency that we're talking about.
That's super helpful. I was caught on to one of the words that you said, veracity adjudication, and that's kind of, I'm assuming it's testing the results and proving. I would love to kind of, if you could like maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of, have you built that internally? Are you using?
Yes, we have. Okay. Yeah. So, depending on where you are in the world, if you testify in court, you generally do something like, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And the reason is that those are three different things. Those are different ways of manipulating the perception of something. So I can tell you all true things, but not all of the things, and cause you to reach the wrong conclusion. That's one way of manipulating. Another is I can tell you a bunch of things that are true and sneak in some things that maybe aren't. That's a different way of manipulating. And then I can also sort of manipulate the way in which you understand it to be true. So there's lots of different dimensions. So generally what we tend to do in veracity adjudication is make sure that we've treated all three of those dimensions in the checks and balances that are built into the algorithms that not only ingest the data, but test it for ongoing usefulness. So data that you collected that was true doesn't necessarily stay true. There's a latency to truth.
Right.
There's also a data that you got a minute ago isn't 1 minute old, right? So understanding that latency is a more nuanced thing. So all of these things are built into the discovery, curation, and synthesis of data. If we don't do all of this, it sounds like a lot of work. If we don't do all of this and we just push that AI button, then maybe you'll be right. Because most data, the capital of France is still Paris, right? But the data that's changing, when we talk about real-time data, there's an implication there that you can use data in real time. Sometimes you can, but maybe you need to test some of these things before you start using it. So it's a continuum, and it doesn't matter where you are in that continuum. It matters that you are where you are by choice and not by accident.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's great to also have someone from the energy space in the panels. Dr. Satyam, it will be great to hear from you as well, because in our experience, like whenever startup founders kind of go and approach the market, they either initially start with like tech companies as their early customers, or they start with financial services companies because that's what they understand. And I think energy is something which is not like as clear to them in terms of like what are the needs and where should they fit in terms of their value prop. So if you could like maybe talk about one or two things that you from the energy space could really get value from when you think of like data products or ML products, that'll be super helpful.
You're on mute, doctor.
Sorry. What I was going to say is, energy sector, and having worked in previous other industries, there's a different beast here. When we talk about real time in finance or in e-commerce, that's a different real time than what we are talking about in different phase of the energy life cycle, right? For example, just give you context. When you're doing exploration, the real time data is literally in megabytes, so to say. But by the time it's analyzed, which is roughly about 2 to 3 years of time, that same data turns into petabytes. So that's what we call data in motion. Now, on top of it is when the algorithms become very important for us. That is, where do I really go find the oil, right? That means you're looking at this 3-dimensional picture of Earth, trying to really figure out how much oil it is. It's all highly uncertain, right? So where the data plays is this kind of data, which now, how do I make it accurate? I don't know. Nobody can say that because you start with significant amount of uncertainty, right? Anything that can help us reduce that uncertainty helps us reduce the cost, correct? Now the second phase, let's talk about drilling, which is very simple. Everybody knows how to drill, so to say, right? We have seen water well being drilled, but the same bigger at a scale. Now that process is 2 to 3 years, depending on where we are. Now there are really real-time implications of interpreting that data, and the data could be in all kinds of possible shape and size, right? And connecting that data sets, again, I think one of the presenter was talking about taking the cloud to the field, where the data is. That becomes very important because most of these operations take place in remote areas. So you really can't move data. Past industry has been moving data at a sample rate of 15 minutes or 30 minutes. That doesn't really help us. Right? In today's world, that doesn't help us in reducing cost. The third one is the production, what happens. So whether once your well is ready, it keeps running for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. But there is a lot of optimization has to be done if you want to really the cost and the production to be right? Like when you listen to all these conversation, OPEC trying to increase or decrease production. So there is a tuning parameter there, correct? And that tuning parameter becomes very critical. Now, again, with the increase in deployment of newer technologies like industrial IoT sensors, augmented reality, virtual reality devices, correct? And the drones, etc., that changes the paradigm of how data needs to be actually analyzed in all 3 areas, basically, the exploration to drilling to production, so to say. And then there is other sites which we will not talk. But the same challenge happens when we are talking about geothermal, or we are talking about in terms of solar panels at the industrial scale or wind farms. Similar kind of challenges are there. So when startups come to us and say that, oh, any kind of data that they can connect, that's where I think most of us really think, what have they known about our data, right? Right, especially as soon as they say any kind of data, and if it's exploration data, we know that they haven't seen it because it's a completely different ball game. And as a result, my advice to startups is understand the problem first. If you are coming into this space, what area of the life cycle you want to address, because you can't address everything. We have been like, our division has been in this business for last 50 years. We ran something like 800 different scientific algorithms, from anywhere from simple models to deep learning to wavelets to Fourier transforms, etc., in some kind of an order, right? So if you want to change something or disrupt something like that, one has to really understand it, what exactly is happening. Just to give you I won't name the company here, but there was a startup from Silicon Valley, and they were doing some little bit of graph databases kind of concept for medical. And they said, oh, they can do it for geology, geophysics. They did a prototype and they created a beautiful graph. But a geologist or geophysicist says, what do? I don't know where the oil is. I don't care about your node, right? So you have the data beautifully picturized, but it doesn't make sense because we are looking at real-time value of it, right? Same thing happens in what you call NLP that everybody talks about. We literally, most of our unstructured data has no natural language. So when somebody says we have a great NLP algorithm, but there is no natural language, so how would you interpret that?
Yep, makes sense. No, that
so these are some fundamental challenges in the industry. This will not go away because that's how the world works. And for startups, understanding the problem, what area of that life cycle we are focused on, will help them to actually increase. So we partner with a lot of startups. It's not that we don't. We have our own, as I said earlier, that hybrid cloud solution for the industry. In between in the stack, we have number of people who have developed some unique solutions, and we embed those, right? Because you can't have a point solution anymore. That was pre-2014. You could do a one software for one problem. That is not possible anymore if you really want to keep cost of producing energy lower. Correct?
Yep, that sounds great, Dr. Satyam. I think you already touched on like a lot of different dimensions of like how startups can think about approaching you or working with you, and we'll like come back to you on talking a bit about that. But I would love to hear from maybe Murli as well. Like if a startup founder needs to, like, if you don't want to build internally, like you said, and buy externally, how should startups think of approaching you and navigating the organization?
I'd love to be able, for the startup to be able to connect what they do at the core well. And rather than think of it as a product that they're trying to push to me, I'd rather they engage with me in saying, what are the top 10 problems you're trying to solve for? And then sort of really help me think through the connectivity of their capabilities to that problem. Unless what they offer is a broad sort of infrastructure capability. And the reason why that's important to me is, if it's an infrastructure capability, then they're going directly to the technology function and they're making their pitch. But if it is anything other than that, there has to be some level of understanding internally around what is the outcome we're looking to achieve? How do we quantify the financial implications of that outcome? And how do we connect that to the capabilities of this startup and the conviction that it can actually be a bridge between where we are and where we want to go? So really, I guess to put it in a nutshell, I'd say is be a little bit more outside in how you think and communicate to augment what I often see an inside out view of what am I trying to pitch, what have I developed, and how can I get this person to believe and see that that's very powerful for them. And it's not that it isn't, but there's a context in which that is connected to the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Understanding that context and being part of that conversation and being able to connect it is very powerful.
I think that's a really powerful point, because like I've seen a lot of early stage companies talk a lot about themselves because they're passionate about it, which is great, but not like ask too many questions to understand the business or the ecosystem. Because once you understand the ecosystem better, you assimilate that within your problem statement and are making a better case for yourself over time. That's very well said. And Anthony, you had a point as well over here. I see.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say here to that comment. That is such good advice. Taking yourself out of the center is one of the easiest ways to get the other person to hear what you're saying. You're metaphorically getting on the same side of the table as them. One of the ways that I think it can be very effective to do that is to position yourself in the comments you're making. I assume that because you're in banking, it must be very important to you to comply with changing regulatory, of course it is. But by saying that, you become part of that person in banking that you're speaking to. So positioning your comment rather than let me tell you how great I am. Even if you are great, people tend to turn that off when they hear it. If you can change I into we, if you can change I know into I assume, then you become more human and much more easy to listen to.
Are there any tactics that you've seen which are beyond this? This is a very core point, and I think this is how the conversations move forward. This is how you qualify both the vendor and the customer. But then, are there any tactics beyond that that you've that stuck with you, that this founder did it really well, and kind of convinced you to work with them?
Well, I think that the way in which they articulated pain points was extremely important. So the danger in articulating a pain point is if I don't have that pain, maybe I'm not listening anymore. So it's definitely, I saw all of the presenters focused on pain points that they were addressing, which I think is very important. I think maybe it's helpful when you do that to sort of answer the unanswered question that maybe you don't feel like you have this pain point right now, but here's why it's becoming important, that kind of thing. What comes to mind is there was a lot of conversation about data localization versus federating things, whether they be computation or actual data. There's an implication there that you have an issue with where your data physically is. Maybe I don't realize I have that problem. Maybe I feel like my data is all in the cloud and I don't have to worry about it. The way I generally get around that is I'll say, well, none of us think there's hard drives floating around in the cloud. There's obviously data centers here. So let's get real about this, something like that, to turn the problem, it's what I call the unknown unmet need. I had a problem. I didn't know I had it. You're addressing it, but you first have to get me to understand that I have the problem before you address it. Otherwise, I'm probably not listening.
Yep.
If I could just add one more thing, in adult learning, there's two filters that adults have to go through or they don't pay attention. One is, are you qualified to speak to me on this topic? And so all of the speakers said, here's who I am, I'm the whatever. And so that's how you partially, or I worked here, I did this thing, I work with these guys. Those are ways of saying I'm qualified to speak about this. And the other is the information relevant? If I said, I'm going to teach you about Chinese verb conjugation right now, which is a joke because they don't conjugate verbs. You're not listening because maybe you don't care, or maybe you know that they don't have verb tenses, or verb conjugation. So, it's easy to turn off now and hear wah. So are you qualified to speak to me, and why is this information relevant?
Yep.
I'll just add 10 more seconds of commentary, if I may.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is, embedded in all of these amazing, introductions we've had in the last hour, and in general, what all of us see in our daily lives is this ability to make the conceptual leap from a capability to how will it connect to what I think of as CFO and CEO talk and perspective. And that gap requires that ability to make a conceptual leap around how the world could be different from an end outcome standpoint in a way that matters to the executive suite. And some people might be able to make those connections immediately. Some people might not be able to. But at the end of the day, to make this sort of a scale viable sort of client relationship, that connectivity has to be pretty lucid.
I think this conversation is so rich that we need a blog post after this to just distill all the comments. Inderpal, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so no, the tremendous comments by my colleagues. The way I do it is, I tend to screen the startups myself. I don't delegate that because I think most of the time, if it's delegated, it will never really come back up to me. I usually, I think my first test is one of perseverance. Are they going to persevere? So I'll just ignore the request for the first maybe 3 or 4 times. and if it comes back to me and they're persistent, that's a good sign. Well, look at it this way. If you bring them into a large enterprise and if they are not persistent, there's just zero chance of them being successful, no matter how good it is.
I just want to pull in the plug for all the founders who reached out to you in the audience. They can reach back out again.
They're all sending 3 emails right now.
Yeah, then I look for just how well the email or the message is expressed. If it's one rambling long thing, that means they haven't quite thought it through. But if they're very crisp, value proposition is clear, they're clear on how they're applying it. At that point, I'll listen to them. I'll give them 15 minutes. That's all they have. And, it kind of then depends on the message that they're able to deliver. Again, I'm primarily focused on value prop when they do that. I mean, what is, it's to Anthony's point that why is it relevant? Why should I, why does it make a difference? And then if they, if that looks good, then I'll warn them. I'll say, especially if the company is like the young companies we had here under 10 million, I'll warn them. I'll say, if you want to dance with the gorilla, fine, I'll bring you in now. I'll point you to the right people, but you're going to have to, it's going to take some resources for you to convince them. It's not like, hey, Inderpal said this and now everybody's in. I mean, you're going to have to win your spurs here. And, many of them will actually drop out at that point. Others will persevere. And once in a while, we get a really, really good hit. I think in our case, it's a little more, there's a second layer of complexity because we're also a supplier of technology. And so it's not just the internal use, but sometimes, if there's an important gap that they're plugging in our portfolio, they're also interesting, right? So that's why I focus on the value prop as opposed to the immediate, the pain point that they're addressing and so forth. But I enjoy it. I usually end up learning a lot from the founders. I mean, just take, the presentations we had today. They were very, I must compliment you all. It was a very good selection. And Janaki, you were not very forgiving. I mean, you didn't even give them 15 minutes. You gave them 7 minutes each. So they really had to, have their act together. But yeah, those are my thoughts on it.
No, those are great points to have in your playbook and in your pocket while you're like reaching out to you or like anyone senior in an organization. And I think to your point, like the fact that you still remember what the companies do and very clearly in 7 minutes means that the companies did a great job. So I totally echo that. Asking this question in a different lens, and maybe I can start with Dr. Satyam again, is if you could like maybe talk about one product that you've loved working with or a startup founder that you've loved working with and that you think of that as a gold standard, that'll just make it more specific to that product, and then people can learn from that too. I think you're on mute again. Can't
I think we had like bunch of them in the past. Some startups, especially I would say 7-8 years back, we were doing AI ML stuff, which they have actually generalized. But I think the days of simplified AI implementations are over now. Mm-hmm. And I think, for example, what Vinay was talking about earlier, that kind of solutions do resonate with us because some of the things that we have done ourselves in last 8-9 years have been very successful. And I think if we look at industry-wide, I'm not just talking about oil and gas, energy sector, but in general, those kind of solutions will be critical if they can be implemented right.
Right.
One of the challenges that I see with some of the startups in the past, they assume one thing, that these big giants can move fast at the speed that they want us to move, which will not happen. Mm-hmm. Right. So that is why I think Inderpal's comment is how persistent they are. That becomes very important. Right. Second is understanding of what the technology stack they are playing with. So we are a service company ourselves. We work with pretty much every oil company or energy companies in the world. There is no one solution that fits anyone. Mm-hmm. Right. So we have to customize, contextualize, and for any startup, whether they are coming to pitch it to us or to anybody else, really need to understand what technology stack are they going to play.
Mhm.
Because replacing or disrupting such big giants is not very easy.
Right.
So
Right.
how do I slide in, so to say, into an existing activity that's going to take place, whether it's from an innovation circle point of view, or actually in partnership with service companies like ours or some others, that can help, rather than trying to say, oh, here is the greatest and the best technology platform that I have built, and it will save you time, but that time is not that critical for them. It's the value or the money that is important, or the production in our case is important, right? And then I saying, how do I do it?
Right. Right.
Right. So these are some of the things. I used to be the IDC president, so I know a little bit about the entrepreneurship side little as well. So I think this is what we coach, that learn the value proposition and where do you fit in that stack.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. Anthony, any one product that comes to mind that you've loved, and that you could tell us why?
Well, yes, without naming the product, because I
Sure. No, absolutely.
So back in the day, there was a product that was trying to focus on two fundamental questions. Are you who you claim to be, and are you authorized to do what you purport to do? And we now call that authentication and validation. And I find it interesting that product went on to thrive and do really well, and they partnered with us quite well. But those are still problems that we have today, because that problem space got bigger. So I wanted to share one thing. I study martial arts, and one of the first things they teach you in martial arts is how to fall down and get back up, right? Really important. But then one of the next things they teach you is in various ways is that you only have 2 feet. And if you want to try to do something more, you have to move one of your feet, and you have to do that on purpose. So if you're focused on whether you're Series A or Series B or that's 1 foot, right? And then if you're focused on your pitch and your value prop and who you want to get contact to, that's 2 feet. And now to Inderpal's point about dancing with the gorilla, which made me laugh out loud. Well, now you have to move a foot, right? You only have so many people, and you only have so much overt intentionality, and they're not changing the number of hours in a day. So which foot are you going to move? Are you going to move the foot of trying to get more money? Or are you going to move the foot of advancing your MVP so that everybody falls in love with it, in order to go do that other thing, which is dancing with the gorilla? And I see a lot of times with this startup mentality that there's no bandwidth. Once you get past step 1, okay, you have my attention. It's very hard even for the smaller company to engage with the larger company, because I may bring 10 people to the meeting. And because it takes me 10 people to cover all of the dimensions of my organization that you need to talk to. Right. You can't talk to 10 people. So what are you going to do about that? It's a very big problem. This fractionation of attention should not be overlooked, because it can kill you way faster than not getting enough money. Right.
That makes a ton of sense. And I think like just a different flavor to the conversation, which is like beyond the core value prop, like the way people pitch it and the way they talk about themselves. The other aspect that like every early thinks about is business model. They think about like, and business model varies based on whether the product has any infrastructure dependencies or does not have any infrastructure dependencies. You could potentially sell it for free. You could sell it like top down, which needs to be paid for. There has to be a pilot period. I don't know how much to charge for it. I think those are like all the early questions that come up. I'm wondering from a freemium versus like top down perspective, like there are a couple of companies that are like, we'll increase the adoption of our product. We'll just like give it out for free, assuming it does not have any infrastructure dependencies. It could be open source, it could be free. And once people get adoption, that's when the organization gets credibility. This is kind of a good product and people are using it. So now we should consider a paid or managed offering on top of that. I'm wondering, like, have you seen those plays being successful, or are you still on the side of like, oh, I'll evaluate the product top down, and once the leaders buy in, that's when we'll start using it in the organization?
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or kind of thing.
Right.
The reason you may have seen me smile is I'm to be honest, and to position myself, not a big fan of the free thing.
Right.
Because it hyper commoditizes whatever you're trying to do.
Mhm.
But I do understand that sometimes you need to get penetration, and everybody expects, to get tremendous value for nothing.
Mhm.
What do you mean I have to pay for the app? That kind of behavior, right?
Yeah.
So we're sort of in this generation and in this modern mindset, we're somehow deluded into thinking that tremendously valuable things are going to be just open source and free and do whatever you want with it. And that's not reality, right? So I think that finding a way to be somewhere in the middle there,
Mhm.
that there's lots of different strategies for that. You can use a little, and then it's not free anymore. You can use a little piece of it, and if you want to use the rest of it, it's not free anymore. You can use it, but only for yourself and not to serve your customers. There are many different, and all of those things have names, right? There's different strategies for doing that, but I think just free, have at it. We'll worry about charging for it later. Generally is like a hyper commodity kind of strategy.
Right.
And it's possible that you have something that is so new that no one has ever seen it before, and they just need to learn to experience it. And by making it free, you'll get them to try it. It is entirely possible. But for most of the businesses represented here today, that's not really the case. So, I think there's a little bit of reality there. Even things that have no marginal cost have fixed cost allocation. They take people, there's infrastructure, there's always something that you're paying for.
Makes sense. Inderpal, what are your thoughts coming from the tech world and also having a lot of tech customers?
Yeah, so I mean, if somebody is talking to me about a free version,
Yeah.
it's probably no good. I mean, look, the way I look at the free stuff is if it's at a stage where my people, who are working for me are coming up and telling me all about this great thing, then it's time to pay attention.
Right.
If they're talking to me about it, it's like, it's a disqualifier. I think the freemiums, I mean, I think that there is a place for them, but that's a ground up maneuver. So, and if it's not being taken up at the grassroots, then there's no point in looking at it. I mean, that's kind of how I shortcut that one. So, if I'm looking at it, I'm going to be looking at the value proposition, etc., and thinking of it only moving forward if I think that, this is going to have tremendous value. So go through our usual process for that.
Right.
And, that's going to be somewhat onerous for the startup.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think not to belabor the point, but I think unless there is grassroots adoption and the team is coming to you and saying we're all using it and there are some collaboration features missing, or there's some security features missing, or there's something else that you can be paying for and it's still adding value, then that might make sense. But otherwise, it's kind of a lost battle to kind of start with. I have one last question, Venk. I just wanted to check, do we have questions from the audience, or I can go ahead with the question?
Just go ahead with the question. If audience has question, they should set it in writing.
Sounds great. Yeah. So if anyone has questions, please add it to the message queue. And my last question is mostly around pricing and how should founders think about pricing? Because then that's a question that comes up in most conversations, that should we be thinking of a flat pricing early on, with more visibility around what that flat pricing is like? Should it be usage-based? But usage-based makes it pretty expensive. Consumption-based makes it super expensive early on for the customer. And there's no justification of making it that unless you can showcase the value. Would love to understand how do you advise startup founders to think about pricing and that business model early on? Murli, we can start with you if you don't mind.
Sure. Thank you. So I might sort of interpret the question a little bit differently, if that's all right, Apurva, which is the first client should be all about creating a pretty well fine-tuned beta version with the client. So you might actually have a product that's 80% of the way through, but getting it from 80 to 95, that's actually worth a lot. And so for me, with that client, really the goal should be to understand the operating context and figure out how will this solution be more deeply embedded so that you understand the full ecosystem within which you want to be able to plug in your solution. That gives you knowledge. It gives you the ability to fine tune your product so that when you have that second, third, fourth, fifth prospective client conversation, it's on a whole different level. So it's a matter to me of what are you gaining from that first client, and really kind of endeavor to not just sell a product to them, whatever the terms of the price might be, but to learn with them and to almost, dare I say, co-create a little bit to further deepen your IP so that you now have a much richer context in which you can have conversations. And the other thing that I would say is to really think about building C-suite relevance, because if you've got sort of the more junior employees, that's really important because they might be the end users, but at the end of the day, the budget and sort of the connectivity to what the corporation more broadly is looking to accomplish in some area or enterprise-wide is better understood by senior executives.
That all that you said is super helpful. I think there are many implications. One is like, don't build in a silo, build with design partners early on. And secondly, have like the right expectations set with the design partner. And if you're not building with the design partner, then you're not building for the real world. And you can gain a lot by building with an enterprise that has real needs. And all of those are like great points.
And the last thing I might add to that, to answer your question more directly, Apurva, is give them a 1 or 2 year license at a relatively marginal cost.
Yeah.
But through that 1 or 2 year period, make sure that there's constant interaction and learning so that you're fine tuning the product, because you're not going to make money off of that first client, but you really want that advocacy from them for other prospective clients. And you want to be able to more finely hone your servicing or offers.
That's great advice. Dr. Satyam, just to segue from there, like, are you open to like being an early design partner for startups, and how do you think about that early program, especially if the company is selling to their first few customers or figuring out the first few customers?
Yeah, Purva, I will just say that we are a very what you call partner-friendly company. Because on both sides, like helping startups or anyone with innovative solutions that can come. And at the same time, because we have reach to the larger ecosystem, so we partner on that side as well. So in that sense, we are very open to that.
Sounds great. I'm sure the founders in the audience will be persistent after this. Anthony, what about you? Like, how do you think about the early design partnership and the pilot period and the pricing after that? And what advice would you give the founders? Not just for Dunn and Bradstreet, but beyond.
First, I would say just listen to what Murli just said, because you saw me smiling. That was fantastic. Right?
Yeah.
I would add to it that there's two ways that you can partner with that trusted beta. And one is to find a way to continually serve them better, make the thing better for them in ways that are scalable to your other customers. And that's the way we normally think about it. There's a question I sometimes ask to the right people that can think in the right way, which is, how could we partner together to serve others in ways that neither of us can separately? And that question can be a game changer, because now the customer is no longer thinking about finding value for themselves. They're thinking about finding value for their customers. And you talk about talking to the C-suite, that's what they want to hear, because that's growth and that's, all kinds of scale and stickiness with their customers, way better than, I found this hammer and it's a great hammer and it's much better than the hammer I had before, and I can hammer bigger nails, but now I can go build houses for my customers. So if you can get to that second question, which is not only partnering with them for a short term with all of that advice that came, but partnering with them in a way that allows them to do whatever it is they do better, now you are sticky forever.
Right. That's great advice. And Inderpal, like, last but not the least, what are your parting words, since we have a few minutes left?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was very sage advice that everybody else gave here. I mean, on the first maybe 1 or 2 customers, I would go so far as to say pricing is unimportant. You really don't want to try to make money out of them. I mean, you're gaining tremendously by understanding, validating the need, but also understanding where you fit in the ecosystem and all that stuff. And you want to make it as easy as possible for them to work with you. So pricing, but they will try to, I mean, that's what I would try to do. If the company was any good, I would try to rope them into a lowball deal for, quite a long period of time. But that's where there is a negotiation. So, they might say, okay, do a 3-year deal or a 4-year deal or a perpetual license. And that's where you have some play, and you kind of restrict it to, let me do it for 1 year or 2 years. And then you also, you better pray that the macro conditions don't turn on you as they've done in the recent past. But that is the right way to play it. So restrict it, but be very giving on that, on the first couple of customers. And then after that, the pricing, will take care of itself, because you'll have a much better handle on how to price it, because you understand where the value is. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been a great time talking to all of you, and a tremendous learning experience for me, and I'm sure for everyone in the audience as well. I'll hand it over to Venk to close, but thank you so much for joining and for sharing all your insights.
This was, as Apurva said, it was really, really useful. I took a lot of notes from this panel discussion, and I'm going to pass this wisdom on to startups that I deal with. I also noticed that our fearless leader, Anita, incoming type president, is also on this thing. So I'll let Anita, I see, propose a vote of thanks. Anita, you're on mute.
Thank you, Venk, and a special thanks to all of you panelists. I mean, great gems of wisdom. I am definitely going to be making lots of emails and calls based on what I heard from Inderpal, and certainly, looking at how we speak outside in with a focus on customers, knowing the data and the environment of the client. Just fantastic for all our startups and our entrepreneurship. And I think that, special thanks to Apurva and to Venk for putting all of this together, and to Team Thai. So happy holidays, and we look forward to doing more of this in 2023. So stay tuned. Many of you said we need a follow-on blog post. So, definitely we'll get that conversation going. Thank you and happy holidays.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you.
holidays.
Thank you.